So the chemical driving force, which tends to cause molecules to move in a particular net direction, is a result of which are the following. So a lot of response for C, and C is a concentration gradient of the molecules, which is correct, okay? So remember, chemical driving force synonymous with concentration gradient. And concentration gradient just translates to how much of particles are, how the different proportions or the different concentration on either side of the membrane. It has nothing to do with the charge. Okay, it has nothing to do with the potential, the membrane potential, the polarity of the cell. That is going to be the electrical driving force. Okay. I also want to explain why it's not D. So it's not active transport. So a few persons selected D here. It's not active transport of the molecules, because remember, active transport requires energy. This is where we're speaking about the natural tendency, the natural forces that are moving these particles according to their different concentrations. So going from high to low concentration. When we think about active transport, that would be moving particles against their natural gradient. That's why that's going to be requiring energy. That's going to be that uphill movement, right? And so active transport will be favoring the movement of particles against their concentration gradient. It's going to require some type of input of energy, whereas the chemical driving force is the natural force that wants to move particles along or down or with their concentration gradient, which we talked about, that downhill movement or that spontaneous movement that actually liberates or releases energy. Okay, so just to really clarify the difference between the concentration gradient, which is the chemical driving force, and then how active transport goes against that. Okay, let's look at another question here quickly. I'll give you a minute and a half for this one. It's a bit more wordy here, so let's launch a poll. And I'll give you a minute and 30 seconds. Okay, last 5 seconds. All right, let's take a look here. Okay, so a lot of response for D, and the question, which statement is false regarding the effect of the electrical driving force created by the membrane potential on a solute? Okay. And so let's actually kind of walk through each of the options here. So no one selected A, but A is, for a solid that is uncharged, the electrical driving force created by the membrane potential is 0. And this is a true statement, right? Remember, a solid, no charge, right? If it doesn't have a charge, there is no electrical driving force associated to move this particle. This is really the force that wants to move charged particles, such as our ions, okay? B, a membrane potential of -70 will exert a larger electrical driving force on calcium, a divalent ion, than on sodium, a monovalent ion. This is also a true statement, okay? So a few persons selected this, but this is true. And remember, we're looking for the false statement here. This is a true statement. If an ion is divalent, it's going to have a stronger force, even if the membrane potential is the same, than the force that would be exerted on a monovalent ion. right? If it's calcium, it's going to be a stronger force moving it in whatever direction because it has two charges on that ion. C, an increased or more negative membrane potential will exert a greater electrical driving force inward on a monovalent cation. So let's kind of walk ourselves through this one. Here, so if we have a negative membrane potential, so let's say we got our cell, it's negative 70 inside, positive outside, really scratchy cell, I apologize. But it's gonna have an increased, more negative membrane potential will exert a greater electrical driving force inward on a cation. So we're thinking about a cation, which is a positively charged particle, like say calcium, like say sodium. And so this statement is also true. There is going to be a stronger inward driving force, right? These types of ions, these cations are going to want to go into the cell more if there is an increase or more negative membrane potential. So if the membrane potential were negative 70, right? Let's say it went from negative 70 to negative 100. These particles are going to really want to get inside that cell. So an increased membrane potential will exert a stronger inward force on positively charged ions. So C is also a true statement. Let's think about D. So we had an overwhelming response for D. The membrane potential exerts a greater inward directing driving force on anions than on cations. So this is not true, right? If we have anions out here, so again, let's think about something like chloride on the outside of our cell, and the inside of our cell we know is more negative, the outside is more positive. Chloride does not want to get here, right? Like charges are going to repel. And so chloride does not want to get onto the inside of the cell the way that cations do, right? Anions have an outward directing force, whereas cations have an inward directing force. Okay, so just to kind of illustrate why D is the false statement and the other statements are true. So the correct answer here is D. All right, what we'll do now, some of these checkpoint questions at the end here, and we'll kind of just walk through these and explain them, and then we will keep it moving. So the first question, what is the difference between passive transport and active transport? So passive transport versus active transport, what are the differences there?
Passive is without energy and active is with energy.
Yeah, perfect. So passive is going to be producing, right? So it doesn't require energy, but it can liberate energy, whereas active requires energy. Anyone have any other ways of expressing that? So that's correct. Any other ways to express the differences here? So thinking about our downhill versus uphill, which of the two would be?
Downhill would usually be your like spontaneous or like passive transport, and then uphill would be your active or non-spontaneous transport.
Perfect. Yes, so that's correct as well. So uphill would be active, downhill would be passive. And another way to think about that is our scenario with the ball, right? Getting the ball to the bottom of the hill doesn't require energy. It's actually going to free up some energy, and that's going to be spontaneous or downhill. And then getting our ball to the top of the hill would require energy to do that movement, moving it against its natural tendency, if you will. Question 2, why is a concentration gradient referred to as a driving force? So why is the concentration gradient referred to as a driving force?
Because it pushes ions together and pushes them through and out the cell.
Yep, perfect. So it's a force that wants to push or move our particles across the cell membrane. Excellent. So that concentration gradient, which is the different concentrations across the membrane, is a force that wants to create equilibrium. So it wants to push or move those forces across the membrane. Number 3 here, in which direction, into or out of a cell, does the chemical driving force for amino acids go? And so that's going to require us to look at the table here on the right And so looking specifically at amino acids and their extracellular concentration versus their intracellular concentration, and think about what direction the chemical driving force would encourage amino acids to move in.
Because the concentration is smaller outside of the cell, it would want to move outside of the cell.
Perfect, thank you. Yes, so because it has a higher concentration intracellularly, a lower concentration extracellularly, it's going to want to move from high to low, which is outside the cell. Okay, and so make sure you're comfortable doing something like that. If I ask you about which direction the electrical driving force on sodium would want to move, given its relative concentration, the chemical driving force, excuse me. So based on the concentration gradient, given its relative concentrations, you should be able to deduce which direction it will move in according to the chemical driving force. Okay, so it'll be moving into the cell for sodium. Okay.